Good day. A few weeks ago, in the run-up to the summit meeting between President Putin of Russia and President Biden of the United States in Geneva, there were a whole series of articles appearing in the United States media and also some off-the-record comments by US officials about the importance of trying to find ways of detaching Russia from its essential alliance with China. This is based on a calculation in the US that the main challenger to the US is now China, that China is the country which is increasingly challenging the United States for global dominance, and that the Chinese challenge can only be resisted or at least held back if some means is found to detach Russia from its de facto alliance with China. In fact, there was even a fascinating article in the Atlantic Council website which spoke about the importance of trying to create issues between the Chinese and the Russians on their common border so as to distract the Chinese away from their current focus on the Pacific and to draw them back towards worrying about their northern border with Russia. All this kind of talk and discussion took place in Washington and in also some other European countries, and it was widely believed by many people that the Geneva summit would be all about that. And indeed, in the days that followed the Geneva summit, in the press conference specifically that President Biden gave directly after the summit, he actually spoke about how the Russians were feeling squeezed, allegedly, by the growth of Chinese power, and how they were anxious, or should be anxious, about the growth of Chinese power on their common border. Well, over the last few weeks, there have been more developments. And 5 days ago, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, and President Putin of Russia had a lengthy virtual summit meeting, timed to coincide with the 100th anniversary celebrations of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. And over the course of that summit meeting, the two leaders, Putin and Xi, agreed to extend for 5 years the Russian-Chinese Friendship Treaty, which was agreed between the two countries back in 2001. And in unison with this agreement to extend the treaty, China and Russia also issued a joint statement. Now, I'm going to come to this joint statement shortly because it is actually truly remarkable. But before I do, I want to say one fact point about the Russian-Chinese Friendship Treaty, which is, of course, that the decision was made, apparently by mutual agreement, to extend it for just 5 years. Now, that begs the question why. Treaties like that are usually extended for 20 years, but why in this case for only 5? Well, there are possibly legal reasons for that, but I'm going to make a guess that the primary reason is that the Russians and the Chinese are actually now working on a new text of that treaty. Russian-Chinese relations have come far further than could have been envisaged back in 2001. They are now allies in all but name, as I will discuss shortly. And I think the next Russian-Chinese treaty, the one that's going to come in 2026, is going to reflect that. But in the meantime, we have this joint statement, and it is to that which I now turn. Now, the first thing to say about the Chinese-Russian statement is that I'm drawing the text from the Kremlin website, but the Kremlin is careful to say that it is an unofficial translation of the text in Chinese and Russian. In other words, it is one which has not been coordinated with the Chinese. Having said that, I am sure that it is accurate, and I have no reason to think otherwise. And it is indeed an extraordinary document. I would add that it's also a lengthy one, as these statements go. It runs to 11 pages, which is unusually long, and it is also unusually comprehensive. And it sets out an alliance in all but name. I say an alliance in all but name, but in fact that's slightly inaccurate, because the document denies that what Russia and China have is an alliance, even though it effectively sets out all the features of an alliance. So let's actually now go to the actual text of this. And as I said, I'm not going to read it all out. It's 11 pages long, but here are some of the things that it says. Russian-Chinese relations have reached the highest level in their history. They are mature, constructive, and sustainable, and promote the development and prosperity of the two countries and the well-being of their peoples, representing a model of harmonious coexistence of the states and mutually beneficial cooperation between them. Russia is interested in a stable and prosperous China, and China is interested in a strong and successful Russia. Considering each other as priority partners, the parties, guided by the treaty, will further strengthen coordination and cooperation in all fields, including political, security, military, trade and economic, humanitarian and international spheres. Having defined strategic support and mutual assistance, integration, a focus on innovation, common advantage and mutual benefit as benchmarks, they will continue developing their comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction in the new era. The Russian-Chinese relations are based on equality, deep mutual trust, commitment to international law, support in defending each other's core interests, the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. While not being a military and political alliance, such as those formed during the Cold War, the Russian-Chinese relations exceed this form of interstate interaction. They are not opportunistic, are free of ideologization, involve comprehensive consideration of the partners' interests and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. They are self-sufficient and not directed against third parties. They display international relations of a new type. Now, let's just pass all of that. I mean, it's a lot of flowery language, but actually there is, in fact, quite a lot of content buried here. First of all, note that they consider each other priority partners. Now, what that means is that as far as Russia is concerned, China is its single most important partner. And as far as China is concerned, Russia is its single most important partner. In other words, for the Russians and for the Chinese, the relationship with each other is the single most important factor in their foreign policy and in their general relations. So Russia, for example, might have important relations with a country like Germany, but ultimately it is relations with China that matter. And China may have or may wish to forge relations with the United States, but it too will prioritize ultimately its relations with Russia. And prioritizing relations with Russia means that they will at all times act to protect each other and support each other in defending each other's core interests. That's what the text says. And those core interests include the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, two countries that prioritize each other, their relationship with each other, and which say that they will defend each other's core interests, including the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity are in effect allies. It cannot be treated in any other way. Because what is an alliance ultimately, at least an alliance between equals, if not a relationship between two states in which they defend each other's core interests and prioritize their relations? And in fact, that's precisely what the Chinese and the Russians say they're going to do. And bear in mind that when they say that they're going to protect each other's core interests, including the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, that commits Russia to defending Chinese interests and aspirations with respect to Taiwan, which of course the Chinese consider to be part of China. So it is in effect an alliance, and it is an alliance in which the two countries will strengthen their coordination and cooperation in all fields, including, and note the order set out, political, security, military cooperation, as well, of course, as trade, economic, humanitarian, and other areas. Now, political security and military cooperation is again the kind of cooperation that generally takes place between allies. And that, it seems to me, is what we are looking at. And it goes on to say that they having defined their strategic support and mutual assistance, they will continue developing their comprehensive partnership and strategic interaction in the new era. Now, strategic support and mutual assistance is, of course, again, language characteristic of allies, and that effectively is what they are. But, of course, we then have the pretense that they are not. And we come to these words. Whilst not being a military and political alliance, such as those formed during the Cold War, the Russian-Chinese relations exceed this form of interstate interaction. Now, let's parse those words very carefully. While not being a military and political alliance, such as those formed during the Cold War, the Russian-Chinese relations exceed this form of interstate interaction. So, they're not in the kind of alliance characteristic of the alliances that appeared during the Cold War. So they're not like NATO, and they're not like the Warsaw Pact. Of course, the Warsaw Pact no longer exists, but NATO does. But their relationship exceeds this form of interstate interaction. So what they're saying here, if you think about it carefully, is yes, actually, they are allies. They're just not allies of the sort that you saw in the alliances that existed during the Cold War, when NATO and the Warsaw Pact were set up. And here we come to the key point, the absolutely critical difference between the Russian-Chinese alliance and the alliances like NATO today and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, and what distinguishes the Russian-Chinese alliance from those alliances. NATO continues to be dominated by one country, the United States, which sets out all the general parameters of policy for all its allies. And of course, the Warsaw Pact was exactly the same, or perhaps so to an even greater degree. It was dominated by the Soviet Union, which again also determined all the parameters of policy for its Warsaw Pact allies. The Russian-Chinese alliance is different because it is an alliance between equals. Both the Chinese and the Russians have said that and repeatedly say this, and this is what distinguishes them from previous alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. In all other respects, however, it is an alliance, and it is in fact a form of alliance which, as the statement says, actually exceeds this form of interstate interaction. In other words, it goes beyond the typical alliances of the sort set out during the Cold War. And we're going to find out soon why. But coming back to the fact that this is an alliance between equals, we read, and this follows directly after that first sentence, that the relations between China and Russia are not opportunistic, are free of ideologization, involve comprehensive consideration of the partners' interests and non-interference in each other's internal affairs. And that, of course, is key, because if you talk about NATO, the nature of NATO is that countries that become members of NATO have to subordinate their interests to those of the United States, which is the leader of the NATO alliance, whereas in a relationship, in an alliance such as the one which exists between China and Russia, each side is required to give comprehensive consideration to the interests of the other. Also, and very importantly, whilst the United States regularly and actively interferes in the internal affairs of the countries it is allied to, and of course the Soviet Union did the same in terms of its allies, the Chinese and the Russians commit themselves not to interfere in the internal affairs of each other. And if we then come to the treaty, to the statement itself, we then quickly learn how deep their coordination is going to be. And we read this: the parties will continue to develop an intensive dialogue at the top and high levels, which is an essential tool for the promotion of the whole spectrum of Russian-Chinese relations. The parties will continue to use leaders' diplomacy, which plays a leading role in ensuring a progressive deepening of the bilateral strategic partnership, including mutual visits, meetings on the margins of international forums, and other contacts between heads of state. They will continue to improve the mechanism of regular meetings between the heads of government, the work of the intergovernmental commissions at the level of deputy prime ministers, the various formats of interregional cooperation as key instruments for coordinating and expanding bilateral, practical and humanitarian cooperation, develop contacts between the heads of the highest legislative bodies, exchanges and dialogue through interparliamentary commissions, specialized committees and commissions and deputy friendship groups, maintain a direct dialogue between the presidential executive office of the Russian Federation and the apparatus of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China in order to coordinate and harmonize matters relating to contacts between the heads of state and implementation of agreements reached, cooperate actively through consultations of the high representatives the strategic security and for public security, justice and law enforcement, on global, regional and national security, and on addressing traditional and emerging challenges and threats. So what that essentially says is that every part of the Russian and Chinese power structure will be operating in continuous dialogue and coordination with the other. The Chinese parliament will be talking to the Russian parliament. The Russian government will be talking to the Chinese government. There will be all sorts of coordinating committees and commissions, most of which we know very little about, but which undoubtedly exist. And in effect, pretty much every move on practically every area and aspect of policy, foreign policy, domestic policy, security policy, economic policy, will take place in a way where the other side is informed of what the one side is doing, and where the two sides cooperate and coordinate each other, with each side acting in consideration of the other side's interests. This is a level of interaction which is unprecedented between governments. There is nothing like it anywhere. You have situations such as the ones which exist in the European Union, where you have a central organisation, the European Commission, which involves itself deeply and intimately in the work of member state governments, but you will never find anywhere a situation where two governments work together as closely and as intimately as this. So this is coordination on an extraordinary scale. And note, in particular, these words, that they will cooperate actively through consultations of the high representatives for strategic security and for public security, justice and law enforcement. Now, strategic security and public security means respectively intelligence and, if you like, the various internal security functions carried out by entities like the FSB and the rest. So what you have here is a commitment not just to coordinate strategic security, in other words, intelligence and domestic surveillance, if you like, with each other, but confirmation that each side has high representatives whose task it is to coordinate strategic security and public security, justice and law enforcement with each other. In other words, there are in Beijing high representatives or representatives of the Russian intelligence and security organs like the SVR, the FSB and the rest, and there are high representatives in Moscow of the analogous Chinese agencies operating in Russia. So there we are, a degree of intelligence and security cooperation that is extremely deep and which is almost certainly at least as extensive as that which we see with the Five Eyes. And of course, that's intelligence and internal security. But there is also cooperation at the military and military technology level. I recently did a program in which I discussed Chinese-Russian cooperation in the military technology field. But we read about this. Russian-Chinese military and military technology cooperation is developing in a spirit of comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation. The parties adhere strictly to agreements on the mutual reduction of armed forces on the state border and on building confidence in the military field. The parties intend to continue deepening interaction between the armed forces by maintaining a regular dialogue between the heads of defense agencies, increasing the number and scope of joint exercises, exchanges between military districts, services and branches of the armed forces, and improving the legal framework and cooperation in the field of military training. So the Russian and Chinese militaries talk to each other at every level, including chiefs of staff and staff levels, even at levels of military districts, that is to say, military units stationed around Russia and China will be coordinating and talking to each other. They will be training alongside each other, and they will even be engaging in exercises, joint exercises with each other. And though there is very little said about military technology cooperation, we know it is taking place because, again, the joint statement says that military technology cooperation is developing in a spirit of comprehensive partnership and strategic cooperation. Now, we don't know, because of course it is deeply classified, what kind of cooperation is taking place. Every so often, a leak takes place. Putin, a short time ago, about a year ago, confirmed that the Russians have helped the Chinese develop their early warning system, for example. But I suspect that there is a great deal more cooperation going on between the two sides in all sorts of fields, most probably because of legacy technologies that the Russians developed during the Cold War. The Russians are providing most of the technology to the Chinese at the moment. It's notable, for example, that both the Russians and the Chinese have, at roughly the same time, both fielded fifth generation fighter jets, the Sukhoi 57 in the case of the Russians, the J-20 in the case of the Chinese, and in both cases these two aircraft are currently flying without the engine, the aircraft engine that is intended for each, the ultimate engine that is intended for each. And I strongly suspect that the engines, we know that both the Chinese and the Russians are each developing an engine for their respective fighter jets, and I strongly suspect that when we finally see it, we will learn that it is essentially the same engine, probably being developed by technicians from both countries, with the Russian version called the Project 30, and an analogous engine, almost certainly very similar, appearing in China. That will probably come in a very few years. So there we go. Intense military, political, intelligence, security and defense cooperation, and cooperation in the technology field also. Again, on a state and at a level unique at this moment in time between two major powers. And then we have a long section on bilateral trade and in economic policy. And I'm not going to go into enormous detail, but I will say this about it. If you read it carefully and you unpack it carefully, what you will find is that the degree of cooperation actually goes beyond establishing mechanisms for mutual trade and all the rest, and mutual payments in currencies, in their respective national currencies. We've known all about that too. What we learn, what we read instead, is things like this, that the parties reaffirmed their commitment to implementing the agreements reached between the leaders of Russia and China to create the Greater Eurasian Partnership in a parallel and coordinated manner, as well as to developing the One Belt, One Road initiative. The parties noted the importance of the Eurasian Economic Union and One Belt, One Road construction plans and their interrelation to ensure continuous and sustainable economic growth in the Eurasian macro region. So, it seems to me that what we are seeing are the early stages towards creating a Eurasian single market, one which will bring together the Russian economy, the Chinese economy, the Central Asian economies like those, for example, of Belarus, all together in one gigantic economic unit, presumably with shared rules, shared infrastructure, all sorts of things. There will not be the central coordinating bodies of the sort that we see with the European Union, and there is unlikely to be a single currency, but nonetheless a degree of economic interaction and economic integration on a simply gigantic scale, with the intention of creating an Eurasian macro region. Now, I said at the start of this video that the decision to extend this treaty for just 5 years, the Chinese-Russian Friendship Treaty for just 5 years, is interesting. I suspect the reason that it is only being extended for 5 years is because the next iteration of this treaty will be, or is intended to be, much more detailed on these economic developments and on the development of this Eurasian macro region. Anyway, that's on economic policies. But of course, there is also a great deal said about coordination of foreign policy and about the way in which the two countries will work together on economic and on foreign policy issues. And we learn, for example, that Russia and China share, this is again from the text of the statement, a common understanding of the need to form a more equitable democratic world order. To this end, the parties should strengthen foreign policy cooperation, uphold common interests on the global stage, and maintain global and regional balance of power. Now, again, the most remarkable words there about other references to the balance of power. Now, concerns about a balance of power are once more features of an alliance. And as I've said, this is an alliance that we're talking about. It may be an alliance that is different from NATO and from the former Warsaw Pact, but it is an alliance and it is concerned about the balance of power, and it seeks a more equitable democratic world order, which is of course implicit. It implicitly means a world order no longer dominated by the United States and by the Western alliance system that the United States has built up around itself. And we further go on to read, the parties will remain committed to genuine multilateralism, will jointly defend the international system, with the UN playing a central coordinating role, and a world order based on international law. Now, in a recent video, I went into a great deal of detail about the difference between international law and the rules-based international order, which we're hearing so much about from the West. And I said that there is a fundamental difference between international law, which is binding on everybody, and a rules-based order, which implicitly means that there is one entity, specifically the United States, which imposes the rules that everyone else is required to follow. Well, here we see that the Russians and the Chinese are committing themselves again to a world order based on international law. In other words, they are repudiating the concept of a rules-based international order that we're hearing so much about from the United States and its allies. Can I just quickly say that the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has written a long essay on this very topic, which I intend to return to in a future program. So we see, once again, foreign policy coordination, basically of the sort that you would expect from allies. Of course, it goes into even more detail. I mean, they talk about arms control, for example, and working together on arms control, on chemical weapons, and how they both seek to preserve and enhance the general ban on chemical weapons and want to see a reform of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which they both see as Western dominated. Perhaps the most interesting thing, though, for me, in relation to this, is what they have to say about the internet, and it is as follows. The parties underscore their unity on issues related to internet governance, which include ensuring that all states have equal rights to participate in global network governance, increasing their role in this process and preserving the sovereign right of states to regulate the national segment of the internet. Well, of course, China does that already with its so-called Great Wall, but it looks as if the Russians are going to do the same. And as far as the Russians are concerned, and as far as the Chinese are concerned, the World Wide Web, dominated as it is clearly, been by the great tech companies, which are all American. The days of the World Wide Web are ending. What we're going to see is a system where states regulate the national segment of the internet, the part of the internet which affects them. So, an alliance between two great powers on a scale that we have never seen, aimed at eventually integrating the entirety of Eurasia, Russia, China, the Central Asian states, Iran possibly, Turkey perhaps conceivably at some point, Afghanistan conceivably too, Pakistan possibly, Belarus definitely, all into one single economic and military strategic union. Perhaps not a political union, definitely not a political union like the European Union, but nonetheless a coordinated structure, the like of which the United States has not been pitted against up to now. Of course, despite all the talk about equality and mutual trust, it'll be the Chinese who will be taking the dominant position in this, as they are by far the bigger power. But Russia remains, in spite of what some people in the West like to say, a great power. And it is true that given that Russia is and continues to be a great power, and one so important to China and so central to this project of Eurasian construction, the Chinese cannot disregard it or impose its ideas upon it in the way that the United States can impose its ideas upon its Western allies in NATO, or in the way that the Soviet Union could impose its ideas on its allies within the former Warsaw Pact. So it will be, obviously, China will be the first amongst equals, but it will nonetheless be, in essence and in fact, an alliance, if not exactly of equals, at least of partners, where the partners have an equal voice or something approximating to an equal voice. This is going to present a challenge, if it develops, the like of which the United States and its allies have never been pitted against before. Now, what about all those brave words about the concerns the Russians must have about the growth of Chinese power on their border? Well, it's interesting that the Chinese and the Russians went out of their way in this statement to say that this issue of the border is of no significance. And in fact, we find in this joint statement, in fact, almost at the beginning of this joint statement, this very interesting paragraph. Russia and China have completely resolved the border issue inherited from history, and now the two countries have no mutual territorial claims. The parties are determined to turn the common border into a belt of eternal peace and friendship, handed down from generation to generation, which will be the cornerstone of our interstate relations. So, any idea that there can be problems created between the Chinese and the Russians on their common border the Chinese and the Russians in this statement go out of the way to say that they are groundless. And as for all the speculations and theories and debates and discussions about the Russians having to fear one day a Chinese advance across the border into Siberia, well, this statement goes out of its way to say that those concerns and fears are completely groundless. And as for the hopes of people like that anonymous writer in the Atlantic Council, that one day there might be problems in between, that there might be military problems on the border, and that the Russians might one day build up their forces again on the Chinese border so as to distract Chinese attention away from the Pacific and the South China Sea. We again come back to these words that the parties adhere strictly to agreements on the mutual reduction of armed forces in the state border areas and on building confidence in the military field. In other words, there will be no repeat of what happened in the 1960s when the Russians and the Chinese positioned large armies against each other along their common border, allowing the United States undisputed and unrestricted control of the Pacific. Those days are finished and they are done. Now, I realize there are some people in the United States who will be cynical about all of this. They will say that the Russians would be foolish to accept these Chinese assurances about the common border. That the reality is that the growth of Chinese power and the supposed decline of Russian power means that the border will increasingly become a problem between China and Russia. Well, I think that those ideas are groundless. But regardless of that, look at this issue from the Russian point of view, which is it's something that Westerners never seem able to do. The Chinese and the Russians settled their problems along their common border back in the 1990s. As this agreement says, there is now no longer any issue between them over the border. Neither makes any territorial claims upon the other. The Russians, in other words, settled the border dispute with the Chinese, and the Chinese have kept their word. Contrast that with what has happened in the West. The Russians in the 1980s came to all sorts of agreements with the Western powers and with the United States about withdrawing from Germany, dismantling the Warsaw Pact, and all the rest. And in return, they received all kinds of promises, repeated promises from the West that NATO would not be expanded eastward. And all those promises were broken. One of the most unattractive, in fact, ugly moments in the interview that Putin recently gave to US NBC television was one where the US interviewer was almost bragging about the fact that the agreements, that the promises that the United States made to the Soviet Union, to Russia, that NATO would be expanded, it would not be expanded eastward, were only verbal, and that the United States therefore felt itself able to basically break them. I have to say, I found that insulting and offensive, as Putin clearly did, with the implication being that the word of the United States is only of value if it is actually written down. Regardless, from a Russian point of view, the Chinese have kept their promises about the interstate border, and the Western powers have violated their promises about the eastward expansion of NATO. The joint statement goes into enormous detail about the trust that the Russians and the Chinese have for each other. Given that the Chinese have up to now kept their word to the Russians. Why should the Russians doubt that trust? By contrast, given that the Western powers broke their promises to the Russians about the eastern expansion of NATO, why would the Russians trust them? So, for the time being at least, I don't see that for the Russians it's really a question of choice. The Chinese have kept their promises to them. They're offering what is in effect a massively important alliance project in which Russia is given a pivotal position, whereas the Western powers have broken their promises to Russia and have imposed sanctions upon it and engaged in relentless information campaigns against it. Is it any surprise, therefore, that the Russians are going with the Chinese and that whatever words were said to them in private, in Geneva and in other places by the US to try to detach them from China, the Russians are paying no attention? The reality is that, in my opinion, this Russian-Chinese alliance is a done thing. It may very well be that some of these projects, the project for Greater Eurasia, the integration of Eurasia into a single market and all of that, maybe those projects are overambitious and maybe they will not be fully realised, though I think it would be unwise to assume that. But overall, and by and large, for the foreseeable future at least, China and Russia will remain key allies, and that alliance looks likely to deepen and to become increasingly important for each country as they work together to reshape the world according to their own interests. The United States and the West, through foolish decisions made in the 1990s and later, have to a great extent brought this situation about. They massively mishandled their relations with Russia, creating this giant alliance system between Russia and China, which is now morphing into a huge Eurasian bloc with resources, aggregate resources, which potentially exceed those of the West. And of course, the United States made it possible to a great extent for China's economy to boom by throwing open its doors to Chinese goods and allowing China to develop its industries at the frenetic rate that they have developed over the last 30 years. It has been a product of a failure of statesmanship in the West on a simply colossal scale. But the thing is now done. The important thing now is to accept that reality and adapt to it. We could find ourselves if the wrong choices are made, in a situation in which the United States and the Western powers try to confront this huge Eurasian bloc that is now emerging in a direct and even confrontational way. If that happens, then my prediction is that the processes of integration that we're seeing in Eurasia between China and Russia and their various partners will actually intensify and accelerate, creating even more problems for the West. Or we could be more realistic. We could speak to the Chinese and the Russians, recognizing that this de facto alliance is now a done thing, try to establish confidence-building measures, set out red lines, and focus upon the rebuilding of our own societies and economies, which are in a fragile state such as I have never known in my lifetime. The choice is ours. Our policies up to now have been poor and misguided, bringing about this crisis, this potential crisis that we are now seeing. If we continue along that road, then that crisis will become existential. We still have time and space to sort things out, to turn things round, to find a way forward that will preserve our own interests and which will guarantee that we remain key parts of the global community. But if we do not, if we mishandle this thing, then we could be faced with a Eurasian colossus, the like of which we have never known, in which case Napoleon's famous prediction about the Chinese giant rising and making the world shake will come true in ways which even Napoleon could never have foreseen. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I hope that you will join me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to join Alex on his own channel. You will find links under this video. Please also look us up on our other platforms, BitChute, ODYSEE, SuperU, and Locals. And please also, to the extent that you can, support us via Patreon, PayPal, and Subscribestar, and also via our shop, where you'll find amazing things like our famous magic mugs, our t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And I hope you like this video. If so, please remember to tick the like button. Please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. And I look forward to you joining me again on future programs. And thank you for joining me today, and have a wonderful day.